and Hannah Henderson from Drive Electric and James Waka have sort of compiled all of this. And if there's a need to do this again, we'd be quite happy to look at that and work with Sigurd and Daryl to ensure that you will have as much information as possible. So if everybody could, as I say, make sure your microphones are turned off. Your video is optional, but if you're having sound issues, maybe try turning video off. And the other thing we are doing to ensure we capture the words correctly from Sigurd and Daryl, we will record this session just so that you're all aware, and hopefully that's okay with Sigurd and Daryl. So look, Sigurd, I'll let you, I think we've got to hand the screen over to you for a period, but if I'll let you and Daryl start the process.
Perfect. Hey, thanks everyone for coming on, and very happy for us to be giving a bit of an update. If someone can give me a yes that they can see the presentation, that'll be great.
Yes, that's good.
Yep, perfect. Cool. So I've just been asked just to give a very light once over in terms of a bit of background, and then I really want to spend as much time going through the Q&A that Mark has very kindly compiled. And Mark, you're quite right, we're very happy to continue to answer questions. This is probably one of many opportunities, and very happy to have this Q&A with the industry. And thanks for setting up this presentation, because it allows us to get messages out to a whole lot of people, and that helps with the efficiency and quality of the information. So that's very kind, Mark. So just very quickly, I mean, the reason that we have got this clean car discount policy coming along at a quick rate of knots really shouldn't be a surprise to too many people. And this graph which I'm showing here is the vehicle emissions model, essentially. And what this shows is what happens with business as usual. And the dot there, which is encircled with a red line, is the Climate Change Commission's final advice that essentially says we need to halve our transport emissions by 2035. And you can see at the moment we're not on track to halving our emissions by 2035. In fact, we get there by about 2050, which we all know is where we have a legislative requirement to achieve net zero. So won't go into the whole picture, but this is quite a good reminder visually just of how much change consumers, the industry and the government needs to get our heads wrapped around and delivering on in quite a short period of time. The other thing which I'm just going to very quickly describe is what we're doing at the moment collectively versus what needs to come around the corner. And so the Ministry of Transport has this avoid, shift, improve framework. So we should try to avoid travel where we can. We should try and shift travel, for example, from the mode of private vehicles to public transport and walking as an example. Similarly with freight. And then once we've, avoided and shifted what we can, well, then we also need to improve the vehicles on our roads. And so that's where electrification comes in. And so I put a bright red bit of text there to show how the Clean Car Standard and the Clean Car Discount sort of fits into that. Now, going back a slide, these sorts of things are still not going to get us to where we need to over the long term. And so the government is currently in the process of developing an emissions reduction plan, which will go out to public consultation before too long. And so you can imagine there's going to have to be a whole lot more pipeline policy, not just in transport, but transport is almost half of the CO2 emissions in New Zealand. But certainly it's going to be a lot of pipeline, policy in the pipeline around the corner. So just giving you that overview. Now, in terms of the clean car piece, there's been a bit of discussion around, okay, what is the difference between the standard and the discount? So I just want to touch on that for a second, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So the thing which is, I guess, sort of jumped the queue, you might say, is the rebates, that kick off in about a week's time. So the Clean Car Standard was announced back in January, and that's going to take a little bit of time to get underway because some legislation needs to be developed for that, and Waka Kotahi needs to develop quite a lot of IT systems there. But starting in about a week's time, once you have paid for a vehicle and registered that vehicle, you can then apply for a rebate for EVs and plug-in hybrids, both brand new and used. And so there are also some tweaks to FBT and depreciation. In other words, you will be able to claim on FBT and depreciation on the reduced car value if it was a rebate. And that whole policy is designed to be consumer facing. It's to allow consumers to get $8,500 off an EV. So from January, we will essentially keep those rebates for the full zero emission vehicles, the EVs, and most plug-in hybrids would also receive the same amount. But basically what we will add is a graduated scale calculated on CO2. And so as the vehicle goes up in its emissions, that level of rebate will reduce up to a point where it gets neither a rebate nor a fee. And then above a certain point, it will have a graduated amount of fees, which you'll be well aware of. Now, the idea of the clean car discount policy from next year is that that's overall cost neutral. So obviously we'll be spending some money this side of Christmas on rebates. So over time, we need to recuperate that money. And as more and more New Zealanders and businesses and even the government buy more low emission and EVs, we'll have to recalibrate which vehicles receive rebates, which vehicles receive fees, and what sizes are those fees and rebates. And so that will be a constant adjustment that needs to be made every sort of 1 to 2 years. The other thing that will need to come in at that same time is a migration to a more accurate form of testing the CO2 on vehicles, which is known as WLTP. And we'll also be updating the fuel economy efficiency label, or the VFEL, so that it's clear to consumers what sort of fee and what sort of rebate they might get on a vehicle. So that would all come in next year. And then I'll just sort of finish by just reiterating a couple of key pieces around the Clean Car Standard. So legislation on that is happening this year. Next year, 2022, is where Waka Kotahi will be spending a lot of their time developing and launching an IT system. And then that will allow importers of vehicles, both new and used, to sort of sign up and begin entering vehicles into that system. And then from 2023, the vehicles that are being imported will be measured and they need to achieve an average target, and there will be charges associated with not reaching that target. But it's really important to understand that if importers bring the right mix of vehicles in, a certain number of utes and a certain number of hybrids, just as a sort of an illustrative example, well, then that supplier need not actually pay fees. The overall ambition for the Clean Car Standard is about a 40% reduction from last year to 2025. And the 2025 ambition is approximately what Europe achieved last year and Japan earlier. And so the Clean Car Standard, as you can see from the bottom right, is an industry-facing policy. So the last thing I was just going to kind of keep on the screen in a way was just this graphic that we put up here. There's a website address at the top where you can go and get more information, and eventually that's also where you'll be able to go to find the form for a rebate. But this graphic here, I guess, visually represents what we're envisaging from 2022. So what I wanted to do at that point was just then move back over to going back to face-to-face, which I think I am now, and just start going through the Q&A.
Okay, thanks. Good summary. What I'd suggest you do, I'm not sure how you or Daryl, whether you're alternating and answering the questions, but I'll let you manage that. But I'd just suggest if you could perhaps ask the question rather than me interceding all the time, maybe just ask quote the question, because these questions I don't think have been sent to everybody. So if you could just state the question and then lead straight into the answer, and then we'll just progressively go through it. So if you could do that, it'd be helpful.
Happy to do that. So I've got 2 Word documents. I'll summarize the question and the answer. So the first topic or theme was about the scheme in general, and so we're talking about the Clean Car Discount Scheme. So the first question was, is there any discussion around removing the 80K cap for simplicity across the whole industry, and the rebate being set at the max value irrespective of RRP? And that's so I guess the way I sort of looked at that question was perhaps it's best just to provide some clarity there. So the policy says that a rebate's only eligible on vehicles up to $80,000, and that includes on-road costs and GST. And the really important piece here is to understand that's on the transaction price. So you might have an RRP or a maximum retail price of say $81,000, but if you sell that to a customer for $79,000, and that's what's on the sale and purchase agreement, then $79,000 is below $80,000, that's eligible. So we just want to see that that particular sale occurred below that threshold. The next question was around.
Sorry, Sigurd, can I just just in the example you provided, just to be clear. So obviously, still just to clarify that also must include on-road costs and GST and that $79,000 number. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and so that's why on Waka Kotahi that form. Sorry.
That's okay. Carry on. Sorry.
The next question was about situations where a vehicle prior to 1 July being able to receive the rebate. So there's a sort of a two-part answer there. So the first and fundamental part is essentially a no. The vehicle has to be first registered from the 1st of July. But the second part of that is there are some particular situations where you can reverse a registration, and so and then register essentially for the quote unquote first time after 1st of July. So some examples of those criteria would be that the MR2D form essentially does that process, and so there's a maximum of a 28-day period from the time it was registered where you could reverse a registration. The vehicle cannot have been driven on the road, or the customer cannot have taken possession of the vehicle. So it's more that classic sort of situation where someone buys a car, you register it, and then they change their mind and they didn't want the blue car, they want a red car instead, and they've actually not driven it away. And so it's that kind of was sort of the part of the background. So there's an existing process, and so that existing process can continue to be used. So there are some situations there, and Waka Kotahi will be in the best position to work with any particular customers or entities that are interested in that, and then they can look at the specific case-by-case details on for a given vehicle or for a given fleet. Daryl, did you want to add anything to that?
Just to the first part, really, in terms of because the question talks about the purchase date, and just to reiterate again, that the key thing is the registration date. So somebody could buy the vehicle today, as long as they don't register it until the 1st of July, then it qualifies.
Yeah, and look, I mean, and that's a very good point. You might have actually, a customer may have purchased it 6 weeks ago, and the vehicle may still be on the water and not reached this natural point of having its registration yet. And so that's fine, so long as the vehicle's registered from the 1st of July. Next question was from 2022, if the car incurs a fee, some questions around kind of who pays the fee. So I guess we don't mind whether it's the dealership or the owner paying the fee. It just has to be paid at the point of registration, and so how that occurs in terms of the money flow, it doesn't particularly mind. The issue though is that the vehicle, the issuing of the registration won't be provided until that fee has been paid. So it's sort of up to the circumstances of a particular transaction how that wants to take place. And so that is different to the rebate, which occurs post registration.
Sorry,
yeah, go on.
There's a question just come in relative to what you have just stated. It said if we register on the 1st of July, the sticker will actually state 30th of June. Will that matter? I mean, what date is the
Yeah, so we've got that. We've had that question come through us separately. We're just looking into exactly what that circumstance looks like at the moment. So probably we'll respond to that after the meeting, if that's okay, to clarify that point.
Thank you.
Just a further question. Sorry, Dennis Kelly from Fleet Partners. Just in terms of process, until we get the registration of the vehicle, we can't prepare our lease documents. So I'm just trying to figure out practically how we're going to pay the fee before the vehicle's registered.
Well, I guess what we're saying is that it shouldn't be any different to now. If we're talking about the fee, all we're saying is we don't mind who pays the fee. And the question was basically who has to pay the fee. So we're essentially replying we don't mind.
Yeah, now my question more so is that until we have the vehicle registration, we can't prepare the lease documents.
Yeah.
And if we can't prepare the lease documents, we can't actually create the financial transaction that will pay the fee. So it's an issue. It's from a.
Well, how do you pay the fee? The vehicles get registered currently, and how does that happen today?
Registered by the dealer at our request. So we provide the dealer with the information of who our customer, who the end lessee is. It's just from a practical point of view, it's not going to work. So we're going to have to figure out a workaround on it.
All right. Maybe something there is for us just to continue talking through that offline, and see if there's something. I mean, the fee side is not till January, so
Sure.
we've got a little bit of time to just clarify that.
Thank you.
How would you pay the fee if you don't have a registration number?
Well, you pay it as part of the process of registering the vehicle.
So you have to do both concurrently?
Correct.
So in our case, as a lease company, as Dennis said, the dealer would have to pay it as well and charge us back on his invoice. Is that suitable?
If the dealer's registering it, yep.
Yeah, dealer register all 99% of the cars in New Zealand. It's not to anyone else. So.
Yep. Yeah, that's acceptable.
Okay, let's carry on to number 4.
So the next one was around, so if a dealer or a distributor is the first customer, then there may not be a VOSA or a sale agreement. And so there was a question around how to determine the best value for that. So that's something that we're just trying to, we've got some answers, but we just want to clarify a few things before we come back to you. So we'll put that back in writing to Drive Electric.
Okay.
So the next theme is around leasing. So the certain aspects of this we can talk about right now, and then there are still some things that we are just finessing the detail on. So the first question was around how the think-out discount works for leased vehicles. And so essentially what we're doing there at the moment is we're having a conversation with the industry, including the FSF, or the Financial Services Federation, just working through some of the mechanics of that. So we'll be able to provide an update in writing before the 1st of July. Essentially, the issue here is that in a lease agreement, typically the lessor owns the vehicle, whereas the lessee is the entity that the vehicle is registered to. And so there are just some practicalities to work through about how to get the rebate to the right place, essentially. So we'll need to come back to Drive Electric and its members on that shortly. What I guess we are contemplating is situations where the lessor could provide sufficient information together with the lessee, such that the lessor could receive the rebate. But there is still some detail to work through before we can confirm that. So the next point is around, do companies pay FBT on the incentive? So I'm not sure whether this was specifically tied to lease or just more generally, but basically what we're working to achieve with Inland Revenue, and it's on the website publicly, is that the post or next price of the vehicle is the one from which FBT and depreciation is based upon. So again, if you've got a $50,000 vehicle and it became, say, $42,000 after the rebate, well, then the FBT depreciation is based off the $42,000. Conversely, if you bought a $50,000 vehicle that became $52,000 next year with a fee, then your FBT and depreciation will be based off the $52,000. So that's, I guess, sort of the fundamental philosophy, and there are some procedures that IR will change to reflect that, and if necessary, we will also reflect that through clarification of legislation this year. So that, I guess, because there has been some calls around whether if EVs could be fully exempt from FBT, so that's not something that's been announced at this point, but what we can clarify is, at least in now, is that separation between internal combustion engine vehicles and EVs through the way that FBT would be calculated as described.
So good. Dean Sheed here. Just a quick question for you based on that, but with a future view. When the penalties come in, I assume the intention is that the FBT price includes any penalties a vehicle may be eligible for.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
both
exactly
the
like
okay, penalty or discount.
Correct. Yeah. So both for FBT and depreciation purposes, penalty or fee.
Okay, this is Nick from SG Fleet. Have we had IRD approval for that?
So it's on public, it's on our website stating what I've just described. So that's publicly written information.
Yes, so we have approval from the IRD that we're allowed to include or exclude the fee or rebate in the FBT price.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, obviously it has to be based on when you purchase that vehicle, and so it's fitting in the time frame where a fee or a penalty actually applied, but yes. So the next section was around dealer demos. So I don't, Daryl, do you want to talk? Have you got some of these in front of you? Do you want to talk to some of these, and we'll share the load?
Okay. So with regard to dealer demos, the question was asked, a declaration is required stating the vehicle is not for on-selling, was for legitimate vehicle purposes or individual use. So I guess behind this question, or behind the intention here, is that the pervasive rule of the scheme and the policy is that the registered party receives the rebate, and the intended party that purchased the vehicle wouldn't be the dealer. But there is some attempt here to carve out some exclusions to say, well, there's some legitimate reasons why the dealer may be eligible for that rebate, and those would be if they're purchasing it for their own company use, like a company car, or they're using it, for example, for as a demo vehicle or a courtesy car. So they are no different from anybody else who's I guess an end consumer and purchaser of that vehicle, and therefore should be treated the same way. And so the declaration provision is really just there to make that clear, and in terms of the obligation or acknowledgement of the purposes. So I think that hopefully answers that question.
Just Daryl, sorry, Dennis Kelly again, a subsidiary question. How long does that vehicle need to be on fleet as a demonstrator, and how many kilometres would it deem to need to have travelled before it's to be able to be on-sold?
Yes, that's a good question, Dennis. And I don't have an exact answer for you today. We're trying to consider that question, and also we'll come back to you on that issue. Apologies, I don't have it today.
Daryl, excuse me, sorry, Dean Sheed again. Quick question as an extension of that one that you've just answered. For dealership demonstrators or service loaners, I understand the position. If a manufacturer or importer has a number of units that they wish to pre-register, do those qualify for either the incentive or the rebate? Or
no.
Penalty, I should say.
I think the short answer of that is no, we don't. So I know that there's been I guess a lot of industry practice out there to pre-register vehicles. that in those circumstances, because of the rule that's in place regarding the first registered party and therefore the explicit exclusions, then that practice is not going to fit within this policy. So that would cause subsequent parties then to be ineligible to claim the rebate. So if anybody's pre-registering vehicles, then those vehicles are going to be ineligible for claim for rebates unless they fit one of those other exemption criteria.
Thank you.
Sorry, is it still me?
Yeah.
I think that covers off most of that theme about dealerships. And there was one little question about how the declaration would need to be made. So we'll publish some information on that by 1st of July.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So that moves on to the data questions.
Yeah.
So Sigurd, I think it's probably best if you take the lead on these ones.
So this is a bit of a shift now. This is getting a lot more technical, which is fine. And then there is also some separate questions that we might have time to look through that were sent through earlier today. So the question here is basically, well, where for new and used vehicles do we get the CO2 data from? Is it independent? Is it from Miami, which is a system used by the new vehicle dealerships? What about for used and grey imports? How do we deal with WLTP and NEDC and so forth? So I guess maybe just sort of starting with the broader stance, which is, there's some work that the government needs to do, and it needs to do it in collaboration with the industry on this. So essentially, when vehicles come into the country, they come with, declared CO2 information, but up to this point, we haven't necessarily been doing a lot with that information. And so that needs to change. And so we will need to ensure that when vehicles turn up, we have a CO2 value that is declared. And then if it needs to be converted from one type of test to another type of test, well, then that will need to be converted. And so then the government would convert that. And there might also be situations where then that result needs to then be provided back to, say, in the case of Miami, might need to kind of go back. So Daryl is also leading a piece of work that looks into that. And so some of that is internal facing, and some of that will also be reaching out to, for example, MIA to work through some of those items. But essentially where we need to get to is that by the 1st of January, subject to the legislation passing before then, we need to be in a position where there's a single source of truth for any given vehicle. And if it's for sale, then there needs to be a very clear single location where we understand what the CO2 number is and what its rebate or zero or fee, element will be, because we need to have that then on the window screen for sale. So sort of that, just saying that generality, what we understand is that Miami holds a lot of that CO2 information at the moment. And that'll be carried across to Waka, Kotahi, and then if needed, as I say, converted over to WLTP. This is something else that we'll be working with MIA on, but there needs to now be a sort of a preparation towards being ready for that. And where manufacturers are able to test vehicles already to WLTP, or can shift to that, well then I guess this is a good time to be making those preparations and working through that. But as I say, Daryl is working, is leading a piece of work on this area, and we'll involve the industry in that. There's some detailed questions such as, will Miami be modified to allow for more complex model ranges and differing CO2 values? And so those sorts of details are things that are going to have to be identified and if necessarily resolved, over the next 6 months. And there was a question around whether the WLTP data would need to be consistent between the Clean Car Standard and the Clean Car discount. So yeah, any vehicle that's entering New Zealand will need to have a single CO2 figure, and then that would be the basis from which these policies would work. Now the targets and some of the treatment might be different. So a vehicle might be receiving one form of treatment under the clean car discount and a slightly different one under the standard. So there are differences there, but that's not about the vehicle having two different CO2 figures. That's about the differences between the consumer-facing incentives and disincentives we're putting there, and then the fleet average motivations that we're guiding the industry on. So there is that difference potentially. And then there was a question about how do you convert from a range of fuel efficiency through to WLTP. And so essentially the short answer there is we expect that manufacturers will be able to provide exact figures for CO2 values, particularly for new vehicles. And that will be something that we need to work with distributors and the MIA on. And then the last question in this series was around the label that dealers would use, like the fuel saver label. And so, as I said earlier, we're updating the mandatory VFEL, and that would display CO2 and fee and rebate information from 2022. And so we would look to automate that. So the existing dealer system where you can print out the VFEL labels would be expanded so that very little difference in your behavior would be needed. You'll just be printing out a label with additional information on it that you can put on the window. And that information would also have to be available on any online listings for that vehicle as well, so not just on the physical car. Shall I take questions on that group of things?
I think there's one point B at the top of the data page. You missed that one, which I think is quite an important one for the used cars and grey import. Where will the information come from, and how will it be validated?
Right. So recently, so I think 2019, it's been a requirement that when vehicles enter the country that the CO2 figure is declared, and so we would make use of that requirement. So similarly, when the vehicle is travelling through the policy process, a CO2 figure would be, from a manufacturer source would be declared and put into the system, and that's how that would be dealt with.
But are you confident that that would be accurate? Because obviously used cars could be up to, I don't know, let's say 5 years old. And, a vehicle, when it's new, we know the CO2 very accurately. After 5 years, you can't use the original figures, and these cars aren't necessarily being tested on arrival. So, I mean, is it not necessary to perhaps have some sort of emissions test on used vehicles entering the fleet?
Well, there's a standardized approach, and so what we've done is we have commissioned work about a year ago through an organisation called ICCT to work out appropriate conversions from one regime to another. So we would make use of that, and over time, Japan, or vehicles particularly coming in from Japan, will be made available with the WLTP. So actually the JDM market has required WLTP already. So actually vehicles coming from the used import market are already starting to come in with WLTP ahead of new manufactured vehicles because just of the legislative frameworks that exist around the world and in New Zealand. So there will be a transition period for used vehicles, but I mean, we're satisfied that the level of accuracy there is sufficient for the policy.
Okay, thanks. That sort of is the list of questions that came in initially, and perhaps as Sigurd said, before we move on to the later questions, if people would like to use the chat function, if they've got another question that we can put to Sigurd or Daryl, or put your hand up, or raise the hand, and we can bring you into the conversation if you've got further questions from the topics that we've just trawled through fairly quickly. Give you a second or two to do that. Nothing coming through at this stage. Okay, so there's no further questions that would appear. So hang on, here we go. Here's a question. What will What will happen if the vehicle
Does not have
a safety rating on the BEV variant?
So we're obligating to ensure that all the vehicles that are eligible for a rebate will have a safety rating provided. If there is ever a possibility that a vehicle comes through without a safety rating, we'll address that urgently in order to be able to ensure that that vehicle claim is able to be processed.
Okay, and there was then the supplementary to that, can we use the ICE vehicle safety rating? But I think you've replied to that saying that you'll probably not. So
the safety rating process is published on the Right Car website in terms of the types of and the process that goes through in terms of to establish the safety ratings for the vehicles. So I think if there's subsequent information after people have gone through that and still want to ask the question, then happy for that to be received by us, and we'll respond to that question.
Okay, there's a good question here from Conrad Healy. I think this is relating to the overall cost impact of vehicle accessories. So there's the basic car, and then someone adds accessories to it. How are these handled? I guess if it's bundled into the retail price that's being paid for, it's either under 80 or over 80. But if you do that, you could potentially, I guess, do the accessories as a separate transaction. Is that how you would understand it?
Tow bars,
roof racks, types of things.
Yeah, so that's our understanding of our advice from MoT in terms of the policy about how it's to be interpreted. And I can say from a processing perspective, the clearer it is on the evidence that's applied to us, the base vehicle price, the easier it is for us to approve that in transaction to identify that is the transaction, the transactional price that we should be referring to.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, if you're selling a vehicle that's $82,000 and the tow bar is $3,000 of it, the easiest thing to do is to only upload the $79,000 base part of the vehicle, and then have the other $3,000 on a separate document that you never supply to us. So that'll make the processing much more efficient for Waka Kotahi. I mean, if the overall price is below 80k, it doesn't matter if it's got $20,000 of accessories on it, because it proves the point that the overall vehicle itself is below the 80k.
Okay, there's a question here from Jackson Ginnells. I'm not quite sure I understand it, but I'll read it out. But Jackson, you might, if Sigurd and Daryl understand it, that's fine. But it says, regarding the Clean Car discount funding, how will the pauses in discounts be signalled to the market in order to reduce uncertainty and prevent any perverse outcomes, i.e. customers stop purchasing efficient vehicles? So this is, I guess, in terms of changes that will be implemented eventually where you start scaling it up or down. Or when the funding runs out, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing to point out is if you do the math, you'll see that there's $301.8 million, and a little bit of that needs to be provided to Waka Kotahi, but essentially the bulk of it is for this purpose of rebates. So it would take quite a lot of market behaviour to exhaust that. But if the policy works as intended, well then over the course of the decade, it could potentially happen. So I guess the key point is that sort of buffer is relatively large, and so that should mean we've got a reasonable amount of notice to identify by monitoring between Waka Kotahi and MoT that that the current trajectory is not suitable. And then the most likely thing to happen really is that we would implement a regime change whereby the fees and the rebates are modified. So if we're running low, well then one option is to reduce the rebate value. Another option is to say it doesn't apply to as many types of vehicles. In other words, it might only apply to EVs and plug-in hybrids and only the best hybrids, or not even regular hybrids anymore. So you kind of restrict that. And then the other side of it is to modify what we do on the fee side. So in other words, fees might apply to a greater proportion of the market, or potentially you could increase the fees themselves. Now, of course, just to point out something which is obvious if you think about it, if we increase the fee size, then potentially the demand on that part of the market reduces, and so you might not necessarily get more revenue just by increasing the fees. But so I would say part of the rationale for having that the dollar amount available to us is to give us that time to identify that the fee and rebate elements need to be modified, and then be able to make that change and give a little bit of notice ahead of the amount running out. But ultimately, the reason that we are saying it is finite is because we can't write a blank check. There's only a certain amount of money that we can devote, and so that's why we have to have that bottom line.
Yeah, so I think the key thing there is just to add to that is that the risk period potentially is greatest before the fees start kicking in, and there's some revenue offsetting the rebates being paid out. But then, as Sigurd said, the numbers would suggest that there'd be quite a transformational change in the market for that to happen. So the risk would appear to be low.
Yeah.
Supply probably a big issue.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. Tanya from LeasePlan, just whilst I think on that chart you signalled the range of the fees, but the question is, when is the legislation for fees expected to be passed, and when will fees be finalised and published? Is there any set date or timeline for that?
So the short answer is we're needing to get the legislation passed before Christmas, and it's up to people besides Daryl and I exactly how quickly that can happen. We are hoping that we could introduce the bill in August. There's still a lot of work to happen between now and August for that to take place, but we're trying to move it with a lot of speed. We can provide indicative fee schedules, and we actually already have provided that to the industry, and so people can look at those figures on the basis that it is subject to legislation and on the basis that there might be some slight shifts to it, but you could use that for general product planning and strategy purposes. It might be a little bit might be a bit risky to confirm that a particular vehicle would receive a certain dollar amount from it. That dollar amount might rise or shift slightly, but we have provided that to Drive Electric, that detail, and so long as it's shared on that basis that it's subject to legislative, being passed, well then we're happy for that to be, provided to others in the industry.
And since you're talking about this, I know there's been a similar question in a similar vein. So intention going forward is that that we'll have public services available for people to be able to use to calculate out what vehicle costs or rebates are going to be for vehicles on either specific vehicles or general as well. And so we'll be developing some online services to support that if people need it. That's both industry and public.
Great. Look, this is moving away from cars for a minute, but there's been it's been in the media a little bit too. But the question's being raised about, are there rebates being considered for electric motorbikes and other sort of micro mobility, be it e-bikes and things like that? And I guess some of the people online are interested in that sector as well.
So, I mean, the short answer is yes, but not yet. So what we've flagged with Cabinet, and Cabinet has given approval for, is that in the future we would consider whether other parts of the vehicle market should be added into the Clean Car Standard or discount policy. And obviously with the light vehicle fleet, that's where the bulk of our emissions are. I think, if I recall correctly, motorbikes are about 0.5%. So it doesn't have the same urgency associated with it. So what we wanted to do was get this policy up and running for the light vehicle fleet, and then as we then get time and we have time to talk with the industry, we can then investigate other parts of the vehicle fleet. So that applies not just for what GVI spoke about, but it would also mean that for heavy vehicles, we'd also look at that investigation. So there's no timeframes on it other than the fact that, we will do that investigation, but the priority is getting the clean car piece working for light vehicles.
Thanks, Sigurd. I mean, you're able to read these questions, I think, obviously, but the next one I'm not sure on. This is talking about a third party involvement with VINs as an example, but are you able to answer that one?
I think this is similar to the question we've covered off earlier, which is about who is able to register a vehicle, and as we've said, we're indifferent to that if that's what the question is asking. So yes, it can be registered as if you've got the correct details. For example, so if you're registering in the party's name and can meet all the criteria for the registration, then we don't object to that process or have any issues with that process. So I don't see that as potentially being disruptive if I've answered that question correctly.
Okay. Yeah, Tanya's after the penalty schedule. Is that going to be circulated, or how did we get a copy of that to participants?
Well, so I provided that to you, Mark, and so on the basis that you're able to share it with your members, on the basis that it's subject to legislation and it's indicative. So long as it is clearly understood to be that, you don't want to look up a particular vehicle and then feel as though that's a commitment that's what that fee or rebate is going to be next year. It should give you a pretty good flavour though.
Okay, so Hannah Henderson's online. So Hannah, if you can just take that as an action point and we'll shoot it out to everyone that's online today. Okay, so are there any more? That's question time. So look, do you want to, there's further questions that sort of came in a bit later about claiming rebates, which I think you've got a copy of.
Yeah, so we can
maybe have a tear into some of those because we've still got about 10 minutes.
Do you want me to do those?
That'd be good.
Okay.
Thanks,
so the first question is about do you need to have a Real Me account to apply for a rebate? The answer is no. It'll be a public access for rebates, and there'd be no login or anything required to do that. There'll be links in a few different places which you'll click through from the 1st of July to be able to fill in that online. Go to a web page and fill in the rebate application. The second question is, can rebates be processed in bulk or do they have to be one at a time? So the answer is one at a time. Next one, can we request the rebate on behalf of our clients? The answer to that is yes, you can. We don't mind who is making the application, just who is receiving it is our key consideration. The next question is, sorry, I can't see my screen anymore because I'm reading off this document, so apologies. Somebody will have to verbally alert me if they want to interject. When leasing a vehicle to a company, the vehicle may be registered to our client, but we own the vehicle. When leasing a vehicle to a company, the vehicle may be registered to our client, but we own the vehicle. Can we claim the rebate and offset the vehicle? So I think that was addressed earlier by Sigurd's comment, as it's currently proposed that does happen, but it's still under due process in terms of approval, and we'll get a resolution publicised as soon as we have it. The next question is regarding financing. So if the vehicle is PPSR registered, does it impact who should receive the rebate? So feel free to interject here because you're the policy guy, but from our perspective, financing of the vehicle is not part of the policy and the criteria. The next question was around certainty of the fund. Again, we've had some discussion about that. There's also on our website and FAQ some information that describes this. Basically, no refunds on registrations until the scheme restarts. But everybody will probably be doing everything possible to ensure that situation doesn't happen. Who can claim the financier or registered person? So the people that can claim are the registered person, and in certain circumstances the lease company, and in certain circumstances the dealer. What is the time frame for payment of rebate post-application? So we haven't made a commitment yet. We know that we've already got a backlog due to some of the transactions which are being queued up since the announcement. So once we get a handle on the processing queue, then we may be able to set a commitment. Other than that, we'll be going like the clappers to get through everything as soon as we can. Paying
faster than the rollout of COVID, presumably. No.
Yes.
It's not there. Sorry.
Paying for fees. So when are the fees applied and who pays for this? So we're assuming the dealer will pay for this and pass the cost back to the purchaser. So we agree that we think that's the best model in most cases and aligns to current practice. Rebate and fee calculations. So from 2022, the rebate will the rebate become scaled or will it remain fixed? So as per the diagram that Zig had put up at the start of this presentation, from 2022 it'll be a scale where you've got low emitting vehicles, not just EVs, that will become eligible for rebates if assuming the legislation goes through. So and then
just to add one little thing there. So it is a scale, although the fully battery electric vehicles get a sort of a boost, and that amount is proposed to still be the same amount as what is starting in July. So yeah, it's a scale, but if it's a zero emission vehicle or then it's subject to a bit of extra help.
Yeah, and at the other end, I guess there's also a cap that comes into play for the fees as well, so it goes up to a maximum. You asked about, the next question is around how much that'll be, and so we've just talked about that, and some information's going out about that, subject to being passed in legislation. Is there a formula that goes with that? So Zig, are you publishing the formula as well with that information?
It's better just for us to publish the schedule, because what we've done with the schedule is we've rounded it to the nearest $10. So the formula would not actually get you to the exact dollar amount that we would propose, although the formula might still be useful for, I guess, sort of more macro analysis. So yeah, I think it's easier just to provide the schedule, and I'll just forward that off to Hannah now, so that she's got the right one.
Yeah, I guess once we have it passed, we can publish that as well, I guess. In terms of so the next question is if the on-road costs would be increased for vehicles over 192. Oh yes, I wasn't sure about actually what this question was actually asking. So sorry, if on-road costs would be increased for vehicles over 192 grams per kilometre, what would vehicles under 146 grams per kilometre have? Would they have a negative on-road cost? So if this question is trying to, so I'm actually not sure what this question is asking, because in terms of on-road costs, the relationship.
I think how I read that is they're independent. So you pay your on-road costs, and if it's subject to a fee, you pay an additional fee, and if it's subject to a rebate, then those are two transactions. You pay the on-road costs, and then a little bit later, some days later, you'll get a rebate. And
so that's right. So that's probably what was confusing me. Yeah.
You don't get a negative on-road cost. You pay an on-road cost and you receive a rebate, some days later.
The next topic is rebate scope. So does the rebate apply to all of government vehicles? The answer is yes. Is a rebate available for light commercial assets as long as they are under the 80K, including GST? Yes, is the answer to that. Can a rebate be claimed if ECA project funding has been awarded for the purchase of EVs? Yes, I believe is the answer to that. I think it's the case, it's independent of any other policy, isn't it? Sigurd?
Yep, that's correct.
Yep. Is there a cap of the number of vehicles a customer can claim for a rebate? So the short answer is no. So if somebody's buying and registering a lot of vehicles. So, for example, a company, then we could expect them to be claiming for rebates for each of those vehicles. Will a rebate be available for second-hand New Zealand new EVs, or is it only for imported used vehicles? So just to be clear, so this is if it's an imported used vehicle, so first time registered for New Zealand, then it's eligible. If it's being resold within New Zealand after that first New Zealand registration, then it's not eligible. And the final question in that set was legislation. When is legislation expected to be passed? As Sigurd said, we hope to have it introduced into the House in August. It needs to be passed by the end of the year. And that was all the other questions I've got.
Done extremely well, Daryl. Thank you. You've roared through those. So look, I think we've just about wrapped up there's quite a few sort of leaving the meeting. So I think on behalf of Drive Electric and everyone attending, special thanks to you, Daryl and Sigurd. Very open, fast paced. It's been great. So it's given people, I think, a lot of insight into the decision making and what's moving forward. Again, if people do have questions, as I said at the beginning, we have committed that we will consolidate further questions and supply those to Sigurd and Daryl, seeking replies. And if we've got enough and we need to do this again, we're quite happy to look at doing this again. But hopefully it's been helpful to everyone that's participated. Thanks for the support and wish you a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you very much. Happy to help.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, no, Jared, an option in an Audi is your terminology. At customer level, it's not an option, that's the car. So it's irrelevant if your car is $79,000 or $89,000.